Coming up, we're taking a look back on last year's deadly attacks on the U.S. Capitol. Plus, 50 years ago, 1972 was a game changer for Native people and policy. We'll find out why. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
Arizona PBS is proud to support Indian Country Today. For 6 decades, we've provided television programs and now digital content. But we go beyond that, sending outreach teams across Arizona, offering workshops in language and literacy, family engagement and community outreach, and supporting tribal communities with early learning and school readiness resources. Join us at azpbs.org.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amarawa Hopa, thank you for joining us. Canada is closer to reaching a $35 billion deal over Indigenous children who were put in foster care unnecessarily. On Tuesday, Canadian officials said they have reached agreements with Indigenous groups to compensate First Nations children. Native kids were previously taken from their homes and put into the child welfare system without cause. This is a major development in a dispute that's long been a sticking point in Ottawa's efforts to advance reconciliation with Indigenous people. Cindy Woodhouse is Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief. She says there is still a lot of work that needs to be done.
We have a long way to go to address the poverty in our nations, and no amount of money will ever be the right amount, nor will it bring back a childhood lost. But today is about acknowledgement, about being seen and heard.
Under the agreements, half of the money will go to children and families harmed by the underfunded and discriminatory child welfare system. Roughly 7% of children in Canada are Indigenous, but they make up more than 52% of children in foster care. Advocates say this system is a modern version of residential schools. Details are being settled between the government and Indigenous advocates over the coming months. A final agreement will be submitted to a federal court for approval. A Native woman makes history. Deborah Juarez was elected as the president of Seattle's City Council in a unanimous vote on Tuesday. Juarez is a citizen of the Blackfeet Nation and is the first Indigenous person to ever hold the office, according to a press release from the city. Gabe Galanda is a supporter of Juarez. He says this news comes at a time when many Native women are taking leadership positions everywhere.
It is time for our Indigenous matriarchs to step forward and seize the mantle in our society and lead us in a new direction. And for many of our societies, we've always been led by women. And I think our society, whether you're in the city of Seattle or somewhere else in our country, would be well served by starting to listen to the advice and follow the lead of Indigenous women and matriarchs.
Juarez says one of her goals is to build stronger relationships between the city and tribal nations. Part of her responsibility as City Council president includes setting meeting agendas and assigning members to committees. If in any event the mayor is absent or incapacitated, Juarez would step up to the role. An overdue education plan is frustrating tribal leaders in New Mexico. The state of New Mexico has plans to address the needs of underserved Indigenous students, but those plans have not been shared with tribal leaders. Tribal leaders were expecting to be invited to comment on a draft last October before a public release on December 31st, but that did not happen. Mark Mitchell is the chairman of the All Pueblo Council of Governors. He said the plans should have been followed up with already. The New Mexico Public Education Department hired former Santa Fe Public School Superintendent Veronica Garcia to write the plan. She says she submitted it in early October for it to be refined and formatted, but never heard anything back. The state's Public Education Department declined to comment on the matter. A statewide alert is being proposed for missing Indigenous women in Washington. Lawmakers say the new bill aims to help identify and locate missing Indigenous women. Currently passing through the House, the law would function the same as a silver alert, which is used when a vulnerable adult goes missing. When activated, the alert would broadcast details of the missing persons to various platforms like highway signs and local media outlets. Washington State Representative Deborah Lekanoff proposed the bill along with the state's Attorney General. She says, in part, "This crisis impacts every one of our families and communities, and it takes collaboration among all governing bodies, law enforcement, and media to bring awareness and stop these horrific crimes." The proposed bill comes after Indigenous survivors and family members spoke to lawmakers last month. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Coming up, we're taking a look back at the year 1972. Mark Trahant shares why that was a pivotal year of Native policy. But first, January 6th is the one-year anniversary of the insurrection. January 6th, 2021 was supposed to be a day where one presidency was handed off to another peacefully. That, of course, is not what happened. Instead, rioters breached Capitol security to stop the certification to seat Joe Biden as the next president of the United States. A year later, more than 700 people have been indicted for their roles in the insurrection. The deadly attack injured 140 officers and left 5 dead. Joining us today is Walter Lamar to give us some perspective on the Capitol insurrection. He's an enrolled citizen of the Blackfeet Nation and a descendant of the Wichita tribe in Oklahoma. His company, Lamar and Associates, provides law enforcement and security consulting services to tribal governments. Welcome back to the ICT Newscast, Walter.
Leah, thank you for the invitation to be with you today. And I'll also take this opportunity to wish you and all your listeners a happy, healthy, and productive new year.
Of course, we love those good wishes. Thank you for that. So I want to take a step back, and I know that you've been following this closely for some time now. Now that we've sort of heard what's happened through these congressional hearings, I think the question lingering for a lot of us is still, how did this happen? What is your perspective now that you've learned more about how this happened?
And it was interesting. As last year, I actually was interviewed by Indian Country Today on the 7th, and then it was all very raw, very emotional, what we had just seen the day before on television. And now here we are a year later, and we're still trying to unpack this thing. There's still a lot that's not visible to the public eye. And as you stated, Congress is looking at it, the FBI is looking at it, a whole host of inspector generals are looking at it, and they're all trying to basically kind of examine the same things. What happened that day? Well, leading up to the Electoral College vote count on January 6th, social media, mainstream media, and then the then administration that were lighting a fire, promoting and calling into question the entire voting process. And of course, this was all in an attempt to cast doubt on the electoral outcome. This huge rally was planned, and as it turns out, we know now there were folks from just about every state in the nation that showed up, and they had a solid, unwavering belief that the election was rigged, their candidate robbed. And then at the rally, with these thousands of folks with that unwavering belief, and we heard this with our own ears. I mean, it's not there for interpretations. We heard it with our own ears. The then president and his minions inciting the crowd, working these folks into a fervor, then urging them to march on the Capitol, fight to stop the steal. There's not much interpretation because we heard it with our own ears. And then we saw with our own eyes the attack. armed with sticks, bats, bear spray, clubs. They descended, I mean, imagine this, they descended on the icon of our democracy in the building where our lawmakers, and these are our elected representatives in this democracy, along with, and this part is to me is just unimaginable, with the immediate contingent of the presidential succession, the vice president, the speaker of the House, and the Senate pro tem. Yet this mob with their sticks and clubs quickly overran this security force and they gained entry. So once they're in, they put the entire foundation of our democracy at complete and total risk. And just as you asked, how the heck does that happen, right? Everybody's calling for truth and accountability. But, let's get to the truth. Let's hold people accountable. And of course, you talk about the Congressional Select Committee, and the one who they would like to hold most accountable is the one who once said, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and still get elected. And this is who they want to, of course, hold accountable. The FBI has charged 725 of these riot participants. And as I said, a number of inspector generals are investigating. So the truth may come, and even some measure of accountability. But despite that, it remains that division, hate, and distrust sadly is still thick in the air. And, I mean, all we got to do is look at social media, and violent rhetoric is becoming normalized. We hear it almost every day. Our right and ability to vote is being ambushed. In this country, I mean, just as you said at the beginning, we've always touted and taken for granted that our democracy continues uninterrupted through a peaceful transition of power. And we've touted that, and we've relied on that. And this day last year called even that basic notion into question. So when I look at this attack, the things that you were talking about leading up, as I try to break it down simply: complacency, complicity, competence, and coordination.
Actually, I'd like to pick up on something that you said earlier, which is that the FBI is investigating the people who participated in this attack. And as you mentioned, they've identified and investigated 700 of those people. Tell us, in your background and given your history working in the FBI, how does this questioning actually work with people?
So one of the things that's the beauty of this investigation is many of the participants actually videoed themselves. They got home, or even before getting home, they were all over Facebook and Instagram and social media touting where they were, what they were doing. And then there was the video from the Capitol. There was a media video. So, it's not like it's a major whodunit, because we've got these people on camera, videos of their actions that day. So when you go into an interview process, we already know who it is. We've got the video right in front of them. That's not really a question. The question is their motivation and potentially the complicity of others that planned and orchestrated this, and then who those people are and what their capacity for further violence might be. Because obviously there's 725 people arrested. There are still across this nation thousands of people who pose a real threat and danger.
I, like a lot of other reporters, have been following very closely who these people are. I think that was a lot of our questions of who did this. And the spectrum is really wide. There's everything from attorneys to former Olympians to, what seem like everyday Americans. But I'd love to hear in your words who these people are.
Well, and one of the things that all it takes is, when I said we saw this with our own eyes, all it takes is to be able to look at that video and see the white nationalist paraphernalia and indicators that were throughout that crowd. To basically look at that crowd and try to analyze who they are simply by their paraphernalia, the t-shirts they were wearing, and the rhetoric. And imagine this, the Capitol police officer that was, all of these racially motivated epitaphs thrown at him, to the point where After he talked about it, he was in absolute tears. I mean, who does that come from? We know who it comes from. And so when we start looking at this profile, I think we're seeing a lot of similarities, a lot of commonalities, and we're seeing a lot of white nationalism, white supremacy, and absolute racism.
I want to switch gears a little bit. Shortly after this insurrection happened, we were getting more photos and videos of the gathering place where all of the members of Congress were at. One of the people present was Oklahoma Representative Markwayne Mullin. And we've seen these photos of, Capitol Police very close to a barricade, and they have guns out, and he's standing right behind them. As a member of Congress, and given your law enforcement, do you think that it was a liability for him to be there?
I mean, it's everything is in the heat of the moment. I mean, there were a number of different congressmen who were and congressmen and women who were obviously they're visibly shaken, some less than others, some former military, and they all took a different tact and approach to it. It's just the heat of that thing, and so I wouldn't really comment on that. But one of the things that I would like to comment on, though, and as I said earlier, we can turn to almost any of the mainstream media, and there's just incessant coverage of January 6th, talking about what happened today and looking at it from every angle and every perspective. But one of the things they're not going to talk about is they're not going to talk about Indian country. And I think that we need to look at this as in context. Absolutely, those of us in Indian country, just like the rest of the nation, we want to see that the Capitol is protected, that it's safe, that our democracy is protected, our democracy is safe. But imagine this, the Capitol complex is 270 acres. 270 acres. So as I've looked at all these different reports, the authorization for the Capitol Police is 2,000 sworn officers, 350 administrative personnel, and they're short right now. So they've got about 1,800 officers patrol 270 acres. And so with us in Indian country, there's all this discussion about missing and murdered. And the missing and murdered is symptomatic of but one thing, and that's our law enforcement program and the difficulties that we're dealing with across Indian country. So let's look at this in comparison and contextualize this. Missing and murdered in Indian country, our law enforcement programs are suffering. 55 million acres that we're tasked with patrolling and managing and being able to provide public safety on. 55 million acres, and that's 3,000, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 cops for 55 million acres. So when we talk about truth and accountability, I think we need to be thinking about this and create a context and say, we got 270 acres here, 2,000 officers. Why is it that there's not this hue and outcry for Indian country when we have 55 million acres and 3,000 officers to patrol it? At any given time, there are reservations out there with 2 and 3 million acres that need patrolling, and they've got less than 5 officers doing it. That's the tragedy. And that's one of the things that we in Indian country need to be looking at, in addition to obviously making sure that the proper emphasis placed on protecting the capital of this country.
Sure. Well, Walter, thank you.
Well, again, thank you for inviting me today, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this very important issue with you today.
When we come back, Mark Trahan tells us why 50 years ago was a remarkable year for federal Indian policy. Mark Trahant has been reporting on Indigenous news for nearly 50 years. He's recently stepped away from anchoring to become ICT's editor at large. And one of the themes that he's exploring is the events that happened 50 years ago that shape federal policy today. Hi, Mark. Welcome back.
Thank you, Leah. Glad to be here.
So you filed a story recently. In a very quick summary, tell us why 1972 was so important.
Well, it's really the whole era of the 1970s. And 1972 was particularly interesting, but the whole era is amazing because the United States was going through this transition from a policy of termination where they wanted to end the treaty relationship and end tribal governments to one of self-determination. And in 1972, a lot of steps were taken to make that policy so.
Yeah, and there was also some really big changes in 1972 aside from Indian policy, and that's something that you explored in your reporting.
Right. We think about it now with a Secretary of the Interior, with Deb Holland, but the very first time a political candidate made a promise to appoint a Native person as Secretary of Interior was 1972. And it was the campaign of Shirley Chisholm, who was the first African-American woman to run for president. She was a representative from New York. The other thing that was interesting is that Lee Cook, who was president of the National Congress of American Indians, was actually on the ballot at the Democratic National Convention to be vice president of the United States. You think about that now, to have a Native person on the ballot as a vice president is pretty extraordinary. There were 60 candidates, so there were a lot. But the way it turned out, the Democrats would have been really smart to nominate Lee Cook because the candidate they picked didn't last and ended up having to withdraw from the ticket. And it became a really unfortunate episode in their history.
It's hard to sort of gauge because there wasn't social media at the time, but what do you think the reaction would have been if that happened?
I think it's probably too early in terms of the national conversation. I don't think the country was ready for that yet. Shirley Chisholm certainly broke a lot of ground with that, and you would not have a Jesse Jackson or a Barack Obama had not she broke that ground. In fact, probably the one who had the best chance was Barbara Jordan, and she ran after Shirley Chisholm. So it shows that it's kind of politics is always layer upon layer upon layer, and you finally get through the breakthrough because of those layers that have come before.
Yes, but what's really interesting, as you just mentioned, is this happened 50 years ago. And to think that now we have Deb Holland, who leads the Interior Department, I would be even curious to see what Shirley Chisholm's reaction would be.
Yeah, it would be wonderful to know. I mean, her and Barbara Jordan, some others would be really, I think, extraordinarily proud of this country and also the work that Secretary Holland has been able to do. One of the things that's so interesting about Holland taking the Interior Department from this era is how effective she's been. She's learned so many of the policy lessons and hit the ground running with changes that need to be made that normally would take a long time for a secretary to even get educated about them.
You know, what's really interesting to me is that coming off of the Trump administration, I think a lot of people, a lot of advocates told me that they were really excited for the Biden administration and what was to come. I could say as a journalist, something that always strikes me is that the Biden administration frequently refers to tribal nations when they're talking about states and cities and other governments, and they always state and tribal nations. And I think that really signifies their view that tribal nations are a sovereign government.
Right. And that really came out of this era of 1972 as well, because it really started with Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon really started the phrase "and tribes" and started to treat tribes as serious governments. And part of it was his philosophy was local government, government's best, and that includes tribes.
Yeah. I'm really curious. We all often learn a lot from history, but what do you think that the next era of Indian country will be called, and how would you describe it?
Well, I have to say I was wrong because I thought the first one was going to be a shift already to one of austerity. And the way we're spending, austerity certainly has been part of it. So I kind of missed on that one. I think tribes are continuing to evolve in terms of their authority and governance. The one that, and I'm going to write a lot about this on my economic project, is one of the really striking things of the way tribes are using capital. And capital, of course, is invested wealth that used to create more wealth. And what's going on right now in Las Vegas is a great example with San Manuel and Seminole investing in serious resources to expand gaming. When tribal gaming first started, tribes hired people from Nevada, and now it's the reverse. Nevada is hiring people from tribes.
And that capital, of course, translates into many different facets of society, and one of those being representation in Congress and in politics overall.
Yeah, representation has grown. I think one of the real success stories is state legislatures. State legislatures is not quite at parity with the population, but it's getting close.
Yeah. Well, before we go, Mark, I want to hear about your economics project, as you just mentioned. Tell us more about that.
We have a grant from the Bay and Paul Foundations to work on Indigenous economics, and partly it's going to be just a complete review of what's going on across the field, but partly it's going to be a deep dive into a field called environment social governance, which is a growing field of how companies' investments are measured.
And what kinds of questions are you hoping to answer with your reporting?
Well, the best one, I think, would be if we can create some metrics so that there would be a graphic that answers the question, how are we doing? And be a graphic that'd be really easy to see and understand.
Sure. Well, Mark, it's nice to see you, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news and updates, visit us anytime at IndianCountryToday.com. I am Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.